boy didn't flinch. Not when the whispers started. Not when the bride's mother gasped. Not even when the groom turned pale beneath the altar lights. He walked slowly, deliberately, down the center aisle, his small shoes silent against the velvet runner. All around him, guests sat frozen, some gripping their champagne flutes, others instinctively reaching for phones they didn't dare raise. In his hand, the boy held a folded note. It wasn't addressed to the bride. The officiant looked confused as the child climbed the final step and extended the paper. With a gentle nod, the man took it, eyebrows knitting as he unfolded it before the crowd. He read the first line, then looked up at the groom. "Callan," he said, voice unsteady, "this is for you." Callan Rivers didn't move. His jaw was tight. His new bride, Maris Dane, glanced at him in confusion, her veil shifting slightly in the breeze. The crowd waited for what they didn't know, but they could feel it, that crack in the air before something changes, forever. Before we go any further, if stories like this grip you, real stories about truth, justice, heartbreak, and healing, please hit that subscribe button right now. Tap like. Leave a comment at the end. It's the best way to support this channel so we can keep bringing you stories that matter. He thought she was gone. Celine, the fiancée who'd vanished weeks before the wedding, the one he toasted with mockery at his engagement party, accusing her of being the kind you just can't trust. He'd moved on, or so he told everyone. Until now, until this boy, until this note. The officiant read aloud, "You once said you'd married the truth. Here it is, standing before you, calling you father. I kept your name from him, but he's yours in every way that matters, and today he wanted to tell you that himself." The words hung in the air like a held breath. Eyes turned to the back of the garden. There, standing just past the last row of seats, was Celine. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't broken. She wasn't begging. She was simply standing, watching, calm, composed, and unshaken by the stares around her, in a dress that moved like poetry in a silence that said everything. Callan's lips parted, but no words came. He didn't have any left. Attention, he thought his ex had disappeared for good, until a 7-year-old boy walked into his wedding and tore the truth wide open. Relate. Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to realize you didn't know half of what they carried inside? Engage. This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's about what happens when someone chooses love over safety, truth over comfort, and what that choice costs. Ask. Stay with me until the end. Because this story doesn't just bring pain to the surface. It brings healing. And maybe, just maybe, it might help you see someone in your life a little differently. That day, Callan Rivers lost everything. His bride, his pride, and the version of himself that believed appearances mattered more than truth. But this isn't his story. Not really. This is Celine's story. The woman the world misunderstood. The mother who never gave up. The one who left to protect her son and came back to show the world who he really was. What led to that moment? What secret did she carry? And how did a little boy become the voice of everything Callan never had the courage to face? Let's begin. Long before the note, long before the wedding. There was Willowbrook, a clean, charming town tucked between low hills and cornfields, where people still greeted each other by name and weddings were planned with scrapbooks and church committees. It was the kind of place where reputations were built over brunch tables and everyone knew everyone, especially the Rivers family. Callan Rivers was the town's favorite son. Ambitious, handsome, polished in every setting. His father had built one of the largest real estate firms in the region, and his mother was the sort of woman who chaired fundraisers before breakfast. Callan carried that legacy well, maybe too well. He knew how to speak just enough humility to balance his confidence. He knew which jokes landed in which crowds. And most of all, he knew how to pick a partner that would enhance the story he told about himself. Enter Celine Marlowe. She arrived in Willowbrook on a quiet September morning, 2 years before the engagement. No grand entrance, just a woman with an old suitcase, a part-time job at the public library, and eyes that seemed to carry something she wasn't ready to speak aloud. Nobody knew much about her, and maybe that's what made people curious. She was graceful, never loud. The kind of woman who listened before speaking and always wore blouses with long sleeves, even in spring. At first, people whispered, who was she? Why had she come here? But over time, her quiet consistency won them over. She volunteered at the local elementary school. She smiled at neighbors. She kept her life simple. And in a town full of people, eager to know your business, that simplicity read as strength. Callan noticed her during a charity auction. She was sorting books behind a folding table, sleeves rolled up just enough to show the faint ink of a line tattoo on her wrist, tiny, almost invisible. A music note. He teased her about it. She laughed. They had coffee a week later. A month after that, he took her to his parents' summer house for dinner. His mother smiled politely. His father said very little. But Callan didn't seem to mind. He liked Celine's softness. It gave him contrast. She didn't challenge his control, didn't ask uncomfortable questions. She blended into his world like a missing puzzle piece. To the public, they were magic. Photographs of them started appearing in local papers, holding hands at the winter festival, dancing at the mayor's retirement party, lighting candles at the Christmas Eve service. The town called them the golden couple. People said it like a prophecy. They looked right together. Callan in his tailored coats, Celine in vintage dresses with hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. When he announced their engagement on the courthouse steps, applause followed. Strangers congratulated them in supermarkets. A bakery offered them a free wedding cake. Everyone believed in their story, except Celine. She wanted to, desperately. There were days she would wake up beside him and try to convince herself this was enough, that the life she had lived before didn't matter anymore, that she could fold it away like a letter in a drawer and let it gather dust. But the past has a strange way of pressing its weight into the present. Sometimes it arrived in dreams, memories of a melody hummed against her shoulder, of a van that smelled like lavender and pine, of laughter that didn't carry obligation. Sometimes it came through her son's voice on the phone, small and brave and aching to tell her he'd learned how to ride without training wheels. "Miss Rowan says I should wait for you to see. I told her you'll be back soon. You will, right, Mama?" Celine would smile with tears stuck in her throat. "Of course I will." Callan never noticed her slipping away to make those calls. Or if he did, he didn't ask. He loved the version of Celine she showed him, the one who nodded during business dinners, who complimented his speeches, who never asked about the fine print of his family's empire. The closer they got to the wedding, the more he spoke in terms of ownership. Our home, our image, our legacy. Celine tried to keep pace. She told herself it was temporary. That after the wedding, once the dust had settled, she'd find the right moment to tell Callan everything. About her son, about her life before, about the way love had once lived in music and not marble countertops. But timing became a wall she couldn't climb. There was always a brunch, a meeting, a photographer, a detail to be fixed. Callan's mother wanted the wedding to be covered in a regional magazine. "It's not just a wedding," she said. "It's a statement." Celine swallowed her hesitation. She tried on dresses she didn't pick. She posed for pictures she didn't want. She rehearsed a future she couldn't quite believe in. And in the quiet hours before dawn, she'd sit on the floor of her walk-in closet with her knees pulled to her chest, wondering how she ended up so far from who she used to be. She thought about Lior constantly, about his small hands and his wild questions, about how he said "I love you" like it was a promise he had no idea might break. She missed him like air, and yet, each time she opened her mouth to tell Callan, she hesitated. He wouldn't understand, not just because of who he was, but because of who she had to become just to reach this far. She didn't want pity. She didn't want judgment. She didn't want to see that flicker in his eyes that would say, "You are not the woman I thought you were." So she stayed silent, and every day that silence grew heavier, not loud, not angry, just heavy. To understand how everything fell apart, you first have to understand who everyone thought Callan Rivers was. In Willowbrook, he wasn't just well-known. He was a symbol of success, of legacy, of a family that seemed to touch everything in town, from business deals to school donations. Callan had grown up in the best house on Ridgeview Lane, the son of a man who built commercial empires and a mother who hosted charity events with waiting lists. By 28, he had already taken over the family firm, launched a development fund for small businesses, and been featured on the cover of a regional magazine as the future of modern leadership. But it wasn't just his resume. It was the way he moved through life. He shook hands like he meant it, remembered people's birthdays, and could switch from boardroom tactics to backyard barbecue jokes without missing a beat. He was polished, strategic, and always knew where the cameras were, even when there weren't any. He was the kind of man you didn't expect to lose. Not in business, not in life. And then came Celine. She didn't arrive with fanfare. No grand entrance, no connections, no backstory that anyone could trace. She rented a quiet apartment near the edge of town and took a job at the public library, afternoons only. People noticed her because she was different, not loud, not flashy, just still. She wore clothes that didn't beg for compliments. She spoke gently, with pauses that made people lean in. There was no drama to her, and yet she had the kind of presence that lingered in a room after she'd left. When asked where she was from, she said, "Different places." When asked why she came, she said, "To rest." Most accepted that. Others were curious, but the questions stopped when Callan noticed her. He first saw her at a town fundraiser, a literacy drive for underprivileged students. He'd been invited to speak, to shake hands, to donate a large check. She was there in the back, stacking books on a folding table. Her hair was tied back with a plain ribbon, and she wore flat shoes and no makeup. She didn't look up when he passed by. That was new for Callan. Later that evening, he made a point to introduce himself. "Callan Rivers," he said, extending a hand. "I know," she replied, shaking it briefly. "I shelve your family's donations every week. No flirtation, no flattery. Just a fact politely delivered." Then she went back to arranging books. Callan left that event thinking about her. He showed up at the library a week later with another box of books. "You've already donated those titles," she told him, scanning the spines. "I figured you could use doubles," he answered. She looked at him, then nodded. "We can—" That was how it began. He started coming by more often, asking questions about the library's programs, offering to sponsor new shelves. Eventually, he asked if she wanted to get coffee. She declined. He asked again 2 weeks later. This time, she said yes. Their first conversation was quiet, unrushed. Callan talked about the town, about his plans for expansion, about everything he was building. Celine asked one question. "When was the last time you did something just for yourself?" It caught him off guard. He didn't have an answer. She smiled, nodded, and sipped her tea. That's what drew him in. She didn't try to impress him. She didn't need him to perform. With her, there were no crowds to please, only silence to sit in. And he liked how calm that silence felt. They started seeing each other more. Walks in the park. Late dinners in places no one would look. People began noticing. Whispers floated. "Who's the woman with Callan? Where did she come from? Why is he so different around her?" He didn't say much. Neither did she. But soon, they didn't have to. Because in a town like Willowbrook, every look becomes a headline, and every story becomes a prediction. By the time spring warmed Willowbrook, Callan and Celine had become more than a couple. They were a story the whole town wanted to believe in. He brought her everywhere now. She was at every dinner, every charity event, seated beside him at the table reserved for names that carried weight. She didn't say much, but she didn't have to. Her presence spoke for her, quiet, composed, and impossible to overlook. People didn't just like her, they admired her. And Callan? He looked different with her. Softer. He still worked the room, still made every connection count, but when Celine was near, his eyes slowed down. His voice lowered. He listened more. And sometimes he stayed longer at events, just to sit beside her and watch people move through the room. It didn't go unnoticed. "Celine suits him," someone said at a local fundraiser. "She's like calm water." A journalist covering the event scribbled it down. It showed up in the town paper the following week. The power couple Willowbrook didn't see coming. Callan cut it out and tacked it to the fridge. Celine smiled and said nothing. She didn't want attention, but she understood what it meant to Callan, so she adapted. She wore the dresses his mother had tailored. She held her posture when people stared. She answered questions carefully, keeping her past folded behind her smile. And every night, when the house went quiet, Celine would sit in the dark and listen to the silence, trying to remember what it felt like to live without fear of losing what she hadn't even shown him yet. She hadn't told him about Lior, not because she was ashamed, because she knew how much this world ran on image, and how fragile trust can be when someone's never had to fight for survival. Callan had never walked through a courtroom with a worn jacket and a toddler in his arms. He didn't know what it meant to patch together a life from nothing but exhaustion and love. He wouldn't understand. Not yet. So she kept it quiet, told herself the right time would come, after the wedding, after the dust settled, after she found the right words. But the truth doesn't wait forever. Callan was riding high. He had booked the Rose Hill estate. His mother had brought in a design team. His father had arranged for press coverage. There would be wine pairings, a curated guest list, live music, nothing small, nothing simple. "This isn't just a ceremony," he said. "It's a statement." Celine nodded, but her stomach tightened every time the word legacy came up. She hadn't seen Lior in weeks. They spoke on the phone, quick check-ins, short bedtime calls. But she wasn't there to tie his shoes or pack his lunches. She told herself it was temporary. Miss Rowan was caring for him. He was okay. She was doing this for their future. But it still hurt. One afternoon, during a site visit to the venue, Celine stepped away from the planners and wandered to the edge of the estate grounds. The hills rolled in the distance. Everything was bright and still. She closed her eyes and imagined Lior running toward her, laughing. The image struck her so deeply, her hands trembled. She wiped her face quickly as Callan approached. "You okay?" he asked, placing a hand on her back. She forced a smile, just taking it in. "You've been quiet lately," he said, half light, half serious. "Thinking about the wedding?" "I guess," she answered. He kissed her temple and squeezed her hand. "Once this is all done, we'll finally get to breathe." She nodded, but her chest felt tight, because she knew what he didn't. They were building a future on a secret, and secrets always leave cracks. The weeks leading to the wedding moved fast, like pages turning too quickly in a book Celine hadn't finished reading. Appointments filled every corner of her schedule. Hairstylists, photographers, tastings, fittings. Every conversation revolved around colors, lighting, seating charts. People complimented her skin, her dress, her calm demeanor. No one asked how she was really doing. She played her part, smiling at the right times, giving polite nods when people admired the ring on her finger. But each day chipped away at her in small, invisible ways. She missed Lior terribly. Every night she'd lie in bed with her phone clutched in her hand, listening to his tiny voice over the speaker. "I drew a picture of us today," he'd say. "You, me, and the lady with the cats next door. Did you put yourself in the middle?" she'd ask. "Always," he'd reply, with a yawn. She'd wait for his breathing to slow, whisper goodnight, and then lie awake for hours, wondering what kind of mother chooses silence over truth, wondering how much longer she could delay the conversation she should have had months ago. But every time she tried to speak up, something stopped her. Callan's schedule, Callan's image, Callan's expectations. He had built their future like a business proposal. Everything planned, everything accounted for, everything polished. He didn't ask her questions about before, and she didn't volunteer them. And that suited him just fine. Still, he noticed her distance. "Is something bothering you?" he asked one morning, folding a silk tie in half with robotic precision. Celine sat at the edge of the bed, staring at her hands. "I'm just tired," she said again, the same answer she'd given a dozen times. "Well, let me know if there's something I can fix," he replied, planting a kiss on her forehead before walking out the door. She waited for the door to click shut before standing. Her shoulders slumped the second he was gone. She wasn't sure when she'd started hiding, maybe from the very beginning. The truth was, Callan made her feel safe, but not known. He loved the version of her that showed up on time, dressed the part, smiled at the camera. He didn't see the woman who had once held her baby in a motel bathroom, rocking him to sleep while counting coins for his next meal. And she wasn't sure he ever could. A week before the wedding, Celine found herself alone in the bridal suite, surrounded by samples of lace and soft lighting. Marjorie walked in, lips pursed, holding a clipboard. "I had them order a backup bouquet," she said without looking up. "Peonies are unpredictable in this heat." Celine nodded, unsure if that required a thank you. Marjorie looked up. "You've done well adapting, Celine. Not many could carry themselves the way you have." "Thank you," Celine said, folding her hands. "But I hope you understand," Marjorie continued. "This family has a name to protect. Appearances are everything. If there's anything in your past that could disrupt what we've built, this would be the time to speak up." Celine met her eyes, heart hammering. "I have nothing to hide," she lied. Marjorie smiled softly. "Good. Then we can move forward without hesitation." Later that night, Celine sat in the bathtub fully clothed, trying to quiet the racing in her chest. She had rehearsed the conversation in her head so many times. She'd start with, "There's something I need to tell you," or maybe, "You deserve to know everything before we go any further." But she never made it past the first sentence. The pressure wasn't just emotional. It was woven into every part of the life she was being folded into. And the fear wasn't just about losing Callan. It was about losing everything she had worked so hard to rebuild. The idea of Lior being treated like a mistake, like a flaw in her character, she couldn't bear it. But the lie was stretching thin, and lies like that always snap. The night before the rehearsal dinner, Celine finally wrote it down. Everything. Not in detail, but in truth. She folded the letter, placed it on the nightstand, and set her alarm early. But when she woke, the letter was gone. She found Callan in the kitchen, sipping espresso. "Morning," he said, sliding a toast onto her plate. "Did you see a letter on the nightstand?" she asked. He hesitated. "I thought it was something old. I threw it out." Celine's throat tightened. "It wasn't old." "Oh," he said casually. "Did you want me to read it?" She shook her head. "No, not anymore." He leaned in and kissed her cheek. "Everything's going to be perfect." And that's when she knew. He didn't want to know her truth. He wanted his version of her to stay exactly the same, and soon, that version would walk down an aisle in a white dress and seal a future built on silence. But even the brightest smiles can cast the darkest shadows. Before Celine was anyone's fiancée, she was a girl sitting barefoot on the hood of a van, staring at a sky full of stars with music pouring through the open doors. The van was old, paint chipped, one headlight dimmer than the other. But to her and Rafe, it was everything. It was their home, their freedom, their shelter from a world that had too many rules and not enough forgiveness. They traveled between small towns with no plans, stopping when the sunsets looked right and the air felt kind. Rafe Elwood didn't believe in settling down. He believed in melodies that came from the gut and promises whispered at midnight. He played guitar like he was trying to heal something inside himself. His songs were rough around the edges, full of verses that came in fragments and chords that sometimes wandered. But Celine loved every note. He would sing to her in parking lots, behind gas stations, on grassy hills that had no name, sometimes just for her, sometimes to strangers with open hands and tired eyes. His voice wasn't polished. It cracked sometimes, and his rhythm faltered, but it was real, and it made her feel seen. Their love was the kind that burned slow, like fire from dry wood. No rush, no pressure, just warmth that lingered long after the moments passed. They cooked on portable burners, made love under blankets in the back seat, and shared secrets like they were exchanging parts of themselves they never wanted back. Rafe wasn't perfect. He forgot things. He joked at the wrong times. He lived too much in the moment. But he never lied to her. He never pretended to be anything other than exactly who he was. And Celine had never known a love like that. He'd run his fingers through her hair and say, "I don't need anything else but this. Just you and whatever we have next." And she'd believe him. One night, somewhere between state lines, a storm was building. They had parked beneath a canopy of trees and were curled together in the back of the van. Rain hadn't come yet, but the wind picked up in slow pulses, and the air smelled like tension. Rafe kissed her shoulder. "Do you think we'll ever get tired of this?" She smiled against his chest. "Only if we forget what it's worth." That was the night they made love like it meant something more, not lust, not escape, something lasting. Afterward, he held her tighter than usual. She could still feel the echo of his heartbeat against her ribs. 3 weeks later, Rafe was gone. The news came through a call from a police officer. Single car crash, a wet road, a tree. No one else involved. She remembered dropping the phone. Her knees hit the floor. She didn't cry at first, just sat there, unable to move, as if her whole body had been muted by the weight of absence. There was no funeral, no ceremony, just a bag of his belongings delivered to the door of the room she'd rented 2 nights earlier. Inside it, a notebook with half-written lyrics, a photo of them laughing behind a roadside diner, and the necklace she'd given him with her name scratched into a cheap silver plate. She found out about the pregnancy 2 weeks later. The second pink line appeared slowly, as if even the test was hesitating to confirm what she already felt deep in her stomach. Celine stared at the result in silence, then turned to the window. Outside, the world continued moving. Cars drove past. People went on with their lives. But hers had split into before and after. She was alone, no family, no backup, just a growing ache of grief and a tiny flicker of life anchoring itself inside her. And still, she chose to keep him, because he was Rafe's, because he was hers. Because even in the shadow of loss, she still believed in love that could outlast pain. She named him Lior, meaning my light, and he became exactly that. Raising Lior was nothing like Celine expected, because truthfully, she had no expectations. There was no guidebook, no reassuring voice on the other end of the phone, no safety net waiting to catch her, just her and him. The first few months were a blur of bottle feeds, long nights, and aching muscles. She rented a one-room space above a pawn shop where the pipes knocked at all hours and heat was a luxury. She kept her son warm by pressing his tiny body against hers and wrapping them both in donated blankets. She took whatever jobs she could find, waitressing, cleaning motels, folding laundry at a 24-hour laundromat that paid under the table. She worked until her feet blistered and her eyes stung. She'd come home sore and exhausted, but the moment she saw Lior's smile, something in her chest softened. He was her anchor. Even as an infant, he had a quiet kind of wisdom in his eyes, like he had arrived understanding that she needed someone to hold on to. He rarely cried. He'd watch her with big, round eyes, content just to be near her. Their life wasn't easy, but it was theirs. Celine made games out of nothing. A spoon became a puppet. A torn book became a bedtime adventure. Leor's laughter, small and sweet, filled the gaps in her broken heart. It didn't erase the grief, but it gave it company. Every milestone felt earned. The first word, Ma, the first step, taken between 2 stacks of thrift store books. The first time he looked up at her and said, "Don't be sad, Mama. I'm here." That night she cried into his blanket after he'd fallen asleep, pressing her face to the soft fabric like it might hold her together. As Leor grew, so did the demands. Preschool cost money she didn't have. Babysitters were unreliable. She learned to carry him on her back while mopping floors, to keep a coloring book in her purse for the long shifts when she couldn't find help. Still, she kept going. Because giving up wasn't an option. The hardest part wasn't the work. It was the isolation. Most people didn't look twice at a woman like her, young, tired, alone. Those who did usually came with judgments, or worse, pity. Few asked about Rafe. Fewer still offered help without strings, so she learned to be her own world. And for a long time, that was enough. But something shifted when Leor turned 5. He started asking questions. "Where's my daddy? Why don't I have one? Did he not want me?" Each question chipped at her carefully built wall. She told him stories, not lies, but softer truths. She told him his father played music, that he had a big heart and would have loved him fiercely. She kept Rafe alive in bedtime memories and whispered goodnights. But the more she gave, the more it cost her. Leor deserved more than stories. He deserved stability. Celine began searching for something better, not just for herself, but for him. A future that didn't rely on stretching paychecks or moving every time rent went up. She started saving, working double shifts, studying job boards. She even enrolled in free online classes offered through a local outreach center. It was during one of those shifts, at a hotel front desk in a cleaner part of town, that she first met Callan. He checked in late, wore a pressed shirt, drove a car she couldn't name but could never afford. He smiled politely and asked for a quiet room. He noticed the way she spoke. Thoughtful, careful, measured. "You from around here?" he asked. "No," she answered, "just passing through, like everyone else." But Callan came back, again and again. "For business," he said, but he lingered, asked questions, brought coffee. He was different from the others, not warm exactly, but consistent, steady, respectful. And Celine, exhausted, protective, craving something solid, found herself drawn to that steadiness. She didn't tell him about Leor, not at first, not because she didn't want to, but because she wanted him to see her without the labels. Because in his world there was no room for unfinished stories, and Celine's story was far from finished. At first, Callan was a flicker of possibility, something Celine didn't dare trust too soon. But he kept showing up, not just physically, but with questions that weren't shallow. He asked about her favorite books, not her past. He noticed how she spoke to strangers, how she held back when others interrupted. He wasn't charming in the way Rafe had been. He wasn't built on impulse and poetry. Callan was structured, quietly sure of himself. He didn't sing, but he remembered what she liked in her tea. It was a different kind of attention, and after everything she had endured, it felt like safety. Callan didn't push. He let the silences be silences. He showed up with takeout when he knew she worked late. He never asked why she didn't invite him in the first few times he walked her home. Instead, he waited on the curb with his hands in his pockets, content just to be present. It was only after a few months that she began to open the door wider. Let him inside, not just into her apartment, but into the space she'd sealed off for years. He never pried, and she never volunteered too much. That was their quiet agreement. She didn't lie. She just omitted. At first, it was easy. Leor was staying with Miss Rowan during extended shifts, and Callan's visits were brief, spaced out by travel and work. Celine moved through the courtship like someone walking a tightrope, balancing honesty and survival, guilt and hope. She told herself she was protecting Leor, that introducing a man with a polished life and powerful family to her son could backfire, that it was too soon, that she needed to be sure. What she didn't admit was that she was afraid, not just of rejection, but of shame, of the possibility that Callan might look at her differently if he knew she'd been someone else before she was his. But Callan was nothing if not convincing. He introduced her to a life with appointments and events. He started leaving clothes in her closet, letting her wake in houses with more space than she needed. His world felt curated, like everything had been arranged for ease and elegance. And for a time, Celine allowed herself to believe she belonged there. She didn't forget Leor. Never. Their nightly calls continued. His drawings filled her bag. His voice, still laced with wonder, kept her grounded. But she couldn't find the right moment to say the words she knew she needed to. "I have a son. Simple, but impossible. Because with each passing day, the risk grew larger. What started as hesitation became omission. What was once temporary turned into silence. Callan began referring to the future as if it had already been written. "We'll live on the edge of town. My family has a property. It's private. You'll love it." That's when Celine noticed the first shift. He didn't speak with cruelty, but there was control in his kindness. He decided things, suggested plans she never agreed to but couldn't quite refuse. He said it all with a smile, never demanding but never really listening either. His parents were more direct. Marjorie, always impeccably dressed, visited her once unannounced. "You're doing well," she said, her eyes gliding across Celine's modest apartment like it was a room waiting to be replaced. Celine offered her tea. Marjorie declined. "There's a lot of attention on Callan," she said. "He's preparing for a public role, a future in leadership. That means scrutiny. You understand?" Celine didn't answer. "You're quiet. That's good. You don't bring drama. Just keep it that way." It wasn't advice. It was a warning. Celine smiled, but something in her spine locked into place. She'd been underestimated before. She knew how to wear calm like armor. Later that night, she told Lior she missed him. "I miss you too," he said. "Are you coming back soon?" "Soon," she whispered, heart aching, but each day made soon feel farther away. Celine wasn't dishonest. She was surviving, crafting a version of herself that could fit into the puzzle Callan had already assembled. Not to betray her past, but to protect what little future she thought she could build. She didn't see herself as hiding. Not then. She saw herself as waiting for the moment when it would all make sense. When the two halves of her life could finally meet without breaking everything apart. That moment never came. Instead, it kept slipping further into the distance, buried beneath floral arrangements, dress fittings, and invitations with her name spelled in gold. And all the while, Lior waited, and Celine hoped that when the truth came, it would be enough, that love, real love, would find a way to survive it. Celine stood in front of the mirror in the guest room of Callan's family estate, smoothing the silk dress that felt more like armor than clothing. The reflection looking back at her was polished, perfect hair, softened makeup, posture straight, a woman carefully sculpted to fit a life she was never born into. But inside, her stomach twisted. It wasn't the dress. It wasn't the pressure of the upcoming wedding. It was the silence of holding her breath every time someone asked about her background. The silence that echoed through her chest when Callan's mother made snide remarks masked as suggestions. The silence that followed, each night, when she whispered goodnight to Lior through a phone instead of from the edge of his bed. He had started calling less, not because he was angry, he was still too young for that, but because he was adjusting. Miss Rowan had enrolled him in a local kids' reading group. He had new friends, new routines. Celine knew she should be happy. But every call that ended with, "Okay, Mama, I'll talk to you tomorrow," felt like a little piece of her was being gently peeled away. Some nights she'd wake up gripping her chest, convinced she'd heard him crying. Other nights she'd stare at the ceiling, remembering the feel of his small hand curled inside hers. The way his eyelashes fluttered when he napped on her lap. The way his laughter could cut through the bleakest day and remind her why she kept going. Now she kept going out of fear. The wedding was a freight train, it couldn't be slowed. Dresses were chosen, seating charts set, florists paid, and Callan had become different. Not all at once, not in an obvious way, but in pieces. He used to listen when she spoke. Now he corrected her mid-sentence. He used to notice when she was uncomfortable. Now he brushed it off as nerves. "Everything has to be flawless, Celine," he said the night before the rehearsal dinner, looking over the vineyard layout like a general mapping a battlefield. "People are watching. We can't afford second-rate anything." She had nodded, not because she agreed, but because resistance had become exhausting. His father, Everett, rarely spoke to her. His mother, Marjorie, made herself visible in ways that didn't need words. Slight glances when Celine chose tap water over wine, smirks when she passed on the caviar tasting. There was an unspoken language in their world, and Celine didn't speak it. She found herself alone more and more. In rooms filled with curated guests and carefully plated appetizers, she felt invisible. Even worse, she began to feel like a stranger to herself. And always, there was the ache for Lior. She'd look down at her phone between meetings, hoping for a missed call, a new photo, a drawing, anything. Sometimes she'd scroll back through their messages, pausing at voice notes he'd sent just to hear his voice again. "Love you, Mama. Don't work too hard." The guilt was suffocating. She told herself this was temporary, that once the wedding was over, she'd bring Lior into the picture. that she'd explain everything to Callan. He'd understand. He had to. But with each day, that hope grew thinner. One evening, she overheard a conversation between Callan and a family friend, a man with silver hair and a firm handshake who said, "You've done well. She's elegant, quiet, knows her place." Callan didn't correct him. He laughed. Celine sat in her car that night for an hour before going inside. She didn't cry. She just stared through the windshield, wondering what part of herself she'd buried to end up here. She had fought too hard to become invisible again, and deep down she knew this was not what love was meant to feel like. The night of the rehearsal, dinner arrived with too much elegance and not enough air. Everything shimmered. The glassware, the vineyard lights, the smiles that looked polished but rarely reached anyone's eyes. Celine stood near the edge of the gathering, fingers gripping the stem of a wine glass she hadn't touched. Her dress was cream and sleeveless, the kind that required posture and silence. Around her, guests mingled like they were performing roles in a stage play. Laughter floated over string music. Waiters moved like shadows. Callan was in his element, talking with ease, one arm around his future brother-in-law, then pivoting to shake hands with someone from a local council. He looked at home in that world, while Celine still felt like she was borrowing space. She watched him closely, the way his jaw tightened when someone brought up financial disclosures, the slight condescension in his tone when someone confused his title. He didn't just want to impress people, he needed to dominate the room, and suddenly, she couldn't look away from that hunger in him. The need to be approved of, the insistence that everything fit into place, including her. Marjorie approached her with a smile that meant nothing. "Everything looks perfect," she said. "Now we just need you to smile a little more. Everyone's watching." Celine blinked. "I'll try." "No," Marjorie said softly with a touch of menace. "You'll do." It was a warning wrapped in elegance. Celine drifted from the crowd, her mind screaming for air. She walked toward the edge of the vineyard, where the lights faded into dusk and only a faint breeze broke the stillness. She didn't hear Callan approach, only felt his presence when his voice cut the air. "You've been distant all evening." Celine turned slowly. "I needed a moment." He stepped closer. "This isn't the time for moments, Celine. You disappear when it matters most." Her eyes locked with his. "Do you even hear yourself?" He tilted his head. "I'm trying to make this perfect. For us." "No," she said, quieter now. "You're trying to make it perfect for them." His jaw clenched. "You think I don't see it? The hesitation in your eyes? The way you freeze when someone asks about your past?" She stiffened. "What else are you hiding?" he demanded. Silence. Her breath caught. "You act like you're grateful, Celine, but you're always holding back, always somewhere else. I have a life outside of this," she said. "One you've never asked about because you've never offered." She felt it then, the line between them snapping. The truth was too heavy to ignore. She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she reached into her clutch and pulled out the letter, the one she had written days ago but couldn't bring herself to give him. She held it out. He didn't take it. "What's this? Everything I couldn't say in front of them." He stared at it like it might explode. "I need you to read it," she said. "Tonight." And then, before he could answer, she walked away. She didn't return to the dinner, didn't look back at the lanterns glowing in the vineyard, or the table with her name card placed beside his. She left the estate, the dress still hugging her frame, the night still humming with music she no longer cared to hear. By morning, she would be gone, and everything Callan thought he controlled would begin to slip through his fingers. The morning sun spilled across the marble floors of the estate, catching the edges of half-finished flower arrangements and untouched wine glasses. Callan sat alone at the long table where the final head count was supposed to be confirmed. His fingers tapped against the oak. The letter lay in front of him, still sealed. He hadn't opened it the night before. He'd assumed it was emotional nonsense. Another plea, another apology. But now, with the silence stretching and no trace of Celine in the estate or the bridal suite, something shifted in his chest. A quiet unease, a sense that control had slipped, and he hadn't even noticed until it was gone. He opened the letter with one sharp tear, each line hit like a cold wave. She hadn't begged, she hadn't blamed. She had told the truth. Not the dramatic kind, but the kind that twisted slow and deep, the kind you don't recover from in one breath. She wrote about her son, about love that didn't fade, even in the shadows, about what it meant to sacrifice everything for someone too small to ask for anything, and still give it all anyway. She wrote about Callan's world, how it offered security but demanded silence, how it praised beauty but ignored depth, how it clapped for her presence but never cared for her essence. She ended it with a single sentence. I cannot marry a man who wants my future but cannot hold my past. Callan read it twice, then a third time. By the time Marjorie entered the room and asked, well, is she getting dressed or not? He was no longer the man who'd stood by the lake making demands. She's gone, he said. Marjorie blinked. What do you mean gone? She left. Callan, don't be ridiculous. We have guests arriving, vendors waiting. You've got time to fix this. But he didn't move. He didn't call her. He just sat there, hollowed out, the truth pulsing like a wound he hadn't known he carried. Celine took the early train out of Willowbrook. She sat by the window with her coat pulled tight around her shoulders, the city blurring past. Her phone was off, not because she feared what Callan might say, but because she needed silence. Real silence. The kind that made space for her own thoughts again. She thought about Lior, his freckles, his soft, sleepy breath, the way he always insisted on picking a leaf to give her after school. She had traded days with him for approval from people who would never love her. She had put her motherhood in the closet and smiled at people who measured worth in whispers and family names. No more. By the time she reached Miss Rowan's house, the sun had dipped behind the rooftops. Lior was already in pajamas, curled up with a book. When he saw her, he blinked, confused for half a second, then ran. Mama! She dropped to her knees and caught him, burying her face in his hair, whispering over and over, I'm here. I'm so sorry. I'm here. That night she stayed in his room until he fell asleep. Then she curled up beside him, fully dressed, too afraid to leave the space where she could finally breathe again. Back at the estate, the wedding was officially postponed, then canceled. Whispers ran wild. Speculation bloomed. Some said Celine had cold feet. Others claimed she had been hiding something from the beginning. But no one knew the truth. Not yet. Callan, for all his pride, said nothing. Until the night of the original wedding reception, where he stood on a balcony with a drink and said to a circle of old friends and new guests, My fiancé walked away. I suppose that's what happens when people hide who they really are. Some women you just can't trust. Laughter followed. Some nervous. Some eager to belong. He downed his drink and smiled like a man who had never lost anything. But far away, in a quiet home where a boy slept peacefully and his mother finally let herself cry beside him, not from grief, but from relief. The real story was still unfolding. And the cracks Callan ignored, they were only just beginning to break open. The days that followed weren't quiet, even though Celine had hoped they would be. She kept the television off, the radio muted, but she couldn't stop the whispers that found her through texts, through friends of friends, through the sting of curiosity disguised as concern. She just left. Was it cold feet? She didn't even say goodbye. Celine didn't respond. She didn't owe anyone answers, not yet. She focused on Lior. Morning started with laughter again. Pancakes shaped like letters, walks through the park with leaves crunching beneath their feet. He told her stories with wild hand gestures and sudden bursts of giggles. He drew pictures of the two of them holding hands with a sun the size of the page overhead. Each one reminded her that no wedding, no reputation, no polished life was worth what she almost gave up. She had nearly erased herself to belong to people who never wanted to know her. Now, she was learning how to breathe again. But outside her small corner of peace, Callan was rewriting the narrative. The engagement party he hosted, the one that should have been a wedding, turned into a performance. He smiled, toasted to new beginnings, brushed off questions with clever remarks. She was never quite ready for the spotlight, he said to a small group of guests. You know how some people seem perfect, until pressure shows you who they really are. His voice was casual, his posture calm, but he was sweating beneath it all. Because while Celine had walked away without shouting a word, truth had a habit of echoing. And someone else had started, talking. One of Celine's former co-workers from the diner days had seen the online chatter, the announcement, the sudden silence, and she remembered the young mother who used to eat her only break meal sitting in a storage room, rocking a baby while finishing cold fries. She posted a simple message. I knew Celine when she was working double shifts to raise her son. She didn't run away from love. She built her life out of it. It went viral, not because it was scandalous, but because it was real. More followed, photos, testimonials, even a few strangers recalling times they saw Celine with her child, looking exhausted but always kind. A mother who had done everything to stay standing when the world tried to knock her down. People started asking different questions, not about why she left, but what Callan had done to make her feel she had to. The tide shifted. It wasn't overnight, but it didn't have to be. Celine never commented, never posted, never corrected. She just lived. She took Lior to a movie, read him stories in bed, started sketching ideas for a small cafe where books lined the walls and music drifted softly from corner speakers. A new dream, one that was hers, fully hers. And each time she looked at her son, she knew something vital. She had made the right choice, even if it broke someone else's illusion. Even if it shook the image Callan had spent years sculpting. She hadn't abandoned anything. She'd come home to herself, and that was more than enough. The ballroom at Willowbrook Grand Hotel had never looked more extravagant. Crystal chandeliers glinted like they held stars, and waitstaff moved through the room carrying trays with glasses that cost more than some people's weekly groceries. This wasn't a wedding reception anymore. It was something colder. Callan had rebranded it as an engagement renewal celebration, a strange title, considering there was no fiancé beside him now. Just Callan, standing tall in a black velvet suit, surrounded by familiar faces and new replacements, people who didn't ask too many questions. He looked unbothered, confident, smiling for photos as if nothing in his world had cracked, but it had, and the crack showed in his eyes when no one was looking. As the evening reached its peak, Callan lifted his glass to quiet the room. A hush fell over the crowd. Every face turned toward him, eager, curious, entertained. "Thank you all for coming," he began smoothly, eyes glinting. "It means a lot that you're here to support new beginnings." Soft applause followed. He went on. "Some of you may have noticed that things didn't go exactly as planned. Life, well, it's full of surprises. Some people walk away without warning, some leave letters, some disappear instead of facing truth." A few polite chuckles rose from the audience, a few gasps. He let them land. "I guess that's what happens when someone can't keep up with the life they signed up for, when they're not honest about who they are." His tone sharpened, not loud, but sharp enough to cut. You give someone your name, your protection, your future, and they choose to vanish instead. Laughter trickled in. Not everyone laughed, but enough did. Callan smiled. "Some women," he said, raising his glass. "You just can't trust." The room buzzed with whispers, clinking glasses, awkward glances. The orchestra picked up again as if nothing had happened. But something had. In that moment, Callan had taken what was private and turned it into performance. And the town, many of whom once praised Celine's grace, stood by and let it happen. Some believed him, others said nothing. A few looked down into their drinks, pretending not to feel the discomfort rising in their throats. Celine wasn't there to defend herself. She was miles away, curled up in a quiet room with her son sleeping soundly beside her. But someone else was listening. An old co-worker, one of Celine's longest night shift companions at a dusty roadside diner, watched a clip of the speech on a friend's social feed and felt her stomach twist. That same night, she opened a blank post and began typing. "I used to work with Celine back when she was pulling doubles to raise her son. She didn't have time for fancy parties. She was always tired, but she never once showed it when her boy called. She used to walk home late, through cold parking lots and broken street lights, just to save cab fare. She never complained. She just kept going." The post was anonymous. It ended with one sentence. She didn't run from love. She protected it. It didn't explode immediately, but it lingered, quietly, steadily, like a spark that found dry grass. The anonymous post didn't come with hashtags or a plea for attention. It didn't mention names or seek to ruin reputations. It just told the truth, and sometimes that's enough. It was shared once, then 5 times, then 20. Within a day, someone reposted it on a popular local Facebook group, Voices of Willowbrook. Comments began pouring in. "I remember her. She was always kind at the gas station downtown. She used to read to her son outside the laundromat on 7th Street. I saw her working 2 jobs while I was on maternity leave. Never complained, just quiet and steady. What began as memory turned into movement. More stories came. Old neighbors, co-workers, classmates from her GED program. One by one, people began to fill in the blanks that Callan's version had left out. Not dramatic confessions. Real-life observations. Moments of silent strength. Of Celine giving without ever asking for anything back. Of her standing in the shadows while others took credit, while others spoke louder. The town that once whispered behind her back started to listen more carefully, and not everyone liked what they heard. At the center of the shift was a single photo, grainy, taken from a cheap phone, but powerful. It was Celine sitting on a curb with Lior cradled in her arms, both of them asleep under a diner's neon sign. She looked exhausted, protective, whole. Someone commented, "That's not the face of a liar. That's the face of a mother." The comments surged, and slowly, the power Callan once held began to thin. He saw it in the way people stopped laughing as freely at his jokes, in the cautious way friends now approached him at luncheons. In the silence that followed any mention of Celine's name, he scoffed at first. She fooled them all, he told his assistant one morning, scrolling past posts with tight lips. She's playing the victim, but the more he tried to control the narrative, the more it slipped. Because truth doesn't vanish when ignored, it grows. A local podcast picked up the story, calling it The Fiancée Who Vanished or Freed Herself. They read the letter Celine had written, interspersed with first-hand accounts from people who had known her. The episode went viral beyond Willowbrook. For once, Celine's name wasn't being dragged, it was being honored, and she still hadn't said a word. Meanwhile, Celine focused on the one thing that had never failed her, her son. Lior began writing poems, little ones, about superheroes, about food, about his mom. One night he handed her a crumpled paper that read, "My mom is strong. She walks through fire and doesn't cry. She gives hugs that last longer than fear. She's the best part of my day." She cried for the first time in weeks, not from pain, from release, from being seen finally, not as someone's scandal, but as someone's home. In another world, Callan posted vacation pictures with his new close friend Maris Dane. He captioned one, "Nothing like starting fresh." But the likes were fewer now. And the comments? They were filled with silence, the kind that says everything. The tide didn't just shift, it roared. Days after the podcast episode aired, a local journalist reached out to Celine. The message was short, respectful. It asked nothing more than if she would consider clarifying her side, not for drama, but to offer balance. Celine didn't reply. She didn't need to. The truth was doing the work for her. A second post surfaced, this time from a volunteer coordinator at a shelter where Celine had worked part-time years ago. She helped run our winter coat drive without ever asking for credit. She brought in donations, stayed late folding blankets, and once gave her own coat to a mother with 2 kids who had nothing but hoodies in January. I remember her because she didn't act like she was above anyone. She acted like we all mattered. That post crossed state lines. Suddenly, Celine Marlowe wasn't just a name whispered in salons or private groups. She became a quiet symbol of resilience. Proof that dignity doesn't always announce itself loudly, but still commands attention when it stands tall. Even national bloggers began sharing the story. One tweet read, "It's wild how fast people will judge a woman for leaving a man until they learn she was carrying a whole child, a lifetime of sacrifice, and still had the grace to walk away without taking him down." The online empathy became hard to ignore. Callan noticed, his team noticed, his parents noticed. And so the damage control began, a soft rebranding. He took a break from social events, unfollowed certain people, made a donation to a local foundation, an obvious PR move. He even posted a black and white photo with a caption that read, "Sometimes silence speaks louder than apologies." The comments weren't kind. "Now you're silent? Where was this energy when you humiliated her? She survived you. That's the story." He didn't respond. The one thing he had feared, losing control of his image, was unfolding in real time. And no matter how carefully he planned the optics, he couldn't control the truth anymore. It belonged to the people now, and they were choosing sides. Celine sat at the kitchen table, an empty mug in front of her, while Lior played nearby with blocks and marbles. The sun poured through the window. Life was normal again, beautiful in its simplicity. Ms. Rowan handed her a letter from the mailbox, a handwritten note in an unfamiliar scrawl. It was from a woman in Vermont who had heard her story and wanted to say thank you. She had read the online posts, heard the podcast, and had just left her own toxic relationship. "I stayed longer than I should have because I thought survival meant silence," the letter read. "You reminded me that walking away can be an act of love too." Celine folded the letter slowly, a quiet smile rising to her lips. That evening, she sat down with Lior and told him a story, not about princes or castles, but about bravery, about choices, about what it means to hold your truth even when people try to strip it away. He listened, head resting on her shoulder, and when she kissed him goodnight, she whispered, "You are the only truth I ever needed." Back in Willowbrook, the buzz eventually softened. People moved on, but they didn't forget. Callan's name no longer carried the same glow. His business continued, but the whispers followed him. Boardrooms were colder, partnerships more hesitant. He had everything money could buy, but not the one thing Celine had earned. Respect, not the kind you demand. The kind that's given quietly after people see who you really are. Celine didn't return to Willowbrook. She didn't need to. She opened a small bookshop cafe near the coast, where the scent of pages and roasted beans filled the air. Customers came for stories. Some stayed for hours. Lior helped stock bookshelves and named their reading corner the Brave Room. The community embraced them. Not because of what Celine had survived, but because of who she chose to become. And that, more than any name, any party, any reputation, was her redemption. She had lived in the shadows of someone else's spotlight. Now she had built a world full of light that was entirely her own. Rosehill Estate had always been the crown jewel of Willowbrook's elite gatherings. On that Saturday afternoon, it glittered with extravagance. Hundreds of white chairs lined the marble courtyard. Golden trim shimmered on everything, from the wine glasses to the ribbon that tied each place card. A string quartet played softly near the garden archway, beneath which Callan Rivers was about to marry Maris Dane. Maris was everything the Rivers family wanted in a daughter-in-law: refined, well-educated, born into wealth, and trained in the language of appearances. Her gown sparkled with hand-sewn crystals. Her posture was flawless. Her smile did not move unless prompted by the camera. This was a wedding sculpted for perception, not love. Callan stood at the altar, hands folded neatly in front of him, wearing a custom tuxedo that cost more than Celine had made in a year. His face held a practiced calm, but behind the quiet composure, something cold churned, because despite the cameras and the crowd, he hadn't forgotten the way people looked at him differently now. He hadn't forgotten the story that slipped from his control, but he told himself today was a reset, fresh bride, fresh vows, a new future unmarred by complications. Guests filled the chairs, fanning themselves politely under parasols. Society figures, business partners, old money families. They whispered and exchanged air kisses, admiring the spectacle. Some even joked about how quickly Callan had bounced back. A few glanced around, hoping for a glimpse of the former bride-to-be, but Celine had vanished, hadn't she? The officiant cleared his throat and stepped forward, script in hand. The music swelled. Maris appeared at the end of the aisle, arm in arm with her father. Her gown trailed behind like a cloud. Gasps of admiration floated across the courtyard, but just as the crowd turned toward the approaching bride, movement stirred near the back row. A small figure stepped out from the far end of the garden path. He couldn't have been more than 7. He wore a navy blue suit, slightly oversized, and his brown curls caught the sunlight. In his hand he held an envelope. Guests turned, confused at first. Was he part of the ceremony, a last-minute flower boy? The officiant paused, glancing toward the child now making his way calmly down the aisle. Step by step, with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was meant to be. Callan's brow furrowed. Whispers grew louder. The boy reached the altar, looked up at the officiant, and held out the envelope with both hands. "This is for him," he said, his voice clear, unwavering. The officiant hesitated, took the envelope, and looked toward Callan. Inside was a folded note, simple, clean, and unmistakably written in Celine's graceful script. He unfolded it, read silently, then cleared his throat again, this time with a tremble. "Before we continue," he said slowly, "I've just been handed a message that, Callan, you should hear—" The air tightened. Guest leaned forward. Callan blinked. "What is this?" The officiant read aloud. "You once said you'd marry the truth. Here it is, standing before you, calling you father. I kept your name from him, but he's yours in every way that matters, and today he wanted to tell you that himself." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Callan stepped back. His voice caught. "What is this? Some kind of joke?" But behind the boy, quietly, elegantly, Celine stepped out. She wore a fitted, deep blue dress. Her hair pulled back, her eyes locked on his. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She was standing tall, composed, fierce without anger, and Callan Rivers, master of image, of control, of stagecraft, saw his carefully built world start to fracture again. For one long second, no one moved. Then came the ripple. Gasps turned to murmurs, murmurs to confusion. Guests shifted in their seats, glancing at one another, unsure if they were witnessing an act of sabotage or a moment of truth too raw for a setting this polished. Maris stood frozen halfway down the aisle. Her eyes darted between Callan, the boy, and Celine. Her perfectly glossed lips parted, but no sound came out. She took one step forward, then another, and then stopped entirely. Callan didn't speak, couldn't. The officiant quietly handed him the letter, but he didn't reach for it. His jaw twitched, his eyes locked on Celine, and behind his practiced composure was something cracking wide open. She didn't break eye contact, didn't flinch. Celine stood not as someone demanding attention, but as someone unwilling to be silenced again. Maris slowly made her way to the altar now, confusion turning to disbelief. "Callan," she said quietly, almost like she was checking if this was really happening. "Is this true?" Callan looked at her, but there was nothing to say. The boy turned slightly, glancing up at Celine with soft pride. She stepped beside him, gently resting a hand on his shoulder. A few guests stood up from their chairs. Others pulled out their phones. A woman near the back whispered, "That's her. That's Celine Marlowe." Now the whispers shifted tone, from curiosity to awe. Maris stood just feet away from Callan now, still holding her bouquet. "Is this your son?" she asked. Callan's mouth opened, closed, opened again. He looked at Lior. Same eyes, same cheekbones, and it hit him like a punch. The resemblance was undeniable. It stole the breath from his chest. He turned back toward Celine. "Why now?" he asked. It wasn't anger in his voice. It was something deeper, a quiet panic. Celine stepped forward not to accuse but to clarify. "Because the truth deserves to be heard," she said, her voice even. "Not buried under suits and lies and rewritten stories. I protected him, not from shame but from men who think love is leverage." Callan flinched at the word. The crowd began murmuring, again, louder now, some of them stepping back from their chairs, unsure what to do, what to believe. Maris looked down at the letter in the officiant's hand. She reached for it, scanned it briefly, then slowly handed it back. Her face hardened, not with fury, but with a dawning realization. She had been a placeholder, a cleanup act, a performance partner in a life where the curtains were now falling. She looked Callan in the eye. "I can't be part of this," she said softly. "Whatever this is." Then, with grace that mirrored the woman now standing beside the boy, she turned and walked back down the aisle, alone. Guests didn't know whether to sit or follow. Silence stretched long and awkward through the courtyard. Callan stood at the altar, no bride, no applause, no script left to read from. Celine took one last look at him, not with bitterness, but with something worse, indifference. She reached for Lior's hand. Together they walked down the aisle that wasn't meant for them, but had become theirs anyway, and no one stopped them. The aisle was silent as Celine and Lior exited the garden, their steps unhurried. The weight of the moment didn't cling to them. It peeled away like dead skin, falling behind with each stride. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. Behind them, Rose Hill Estate stood frozen in a kind of shocked dignity. No one spoke. Some guests slowly sat back down. Others rose to leave, their heels clacking against marble tiles like punctuation marks on a broken sentence. Callan remained at the altar, alone, still. His hands, once so perfectly posed, now hung loose at his sides. His mind, usually sharp and 2 steps ahead, had gone blank. He saw Celine's back fade into the columns and garden hedges. He saw the boy reach for her hand, and he felt something hollow and vast stretch open inside him. He looked at the note in the officiant's hand again. Not just words, proof, truth, delivered by the one person he never thought would speak. The man who once curated perfection now stood exposed, stripped of grace, stripped of illusion. His mother rose from the front row, face stiff, lips pinched, and walked out without a word. His father followed, slowly, like a man leaving a funeral. The photographer had stopped taking pictures. The quartet had gone silent. Callan turned, finally, and left the altar. No bride, no crowd, no applause. Later that evening, Maris sat in her dressing suite, still in her gown, makeup streaked, veil cast on the floor like shed armor. Her sister sat beside her, offering nothing but presents. No one asked her to return to the altar. No one urged her to continue the day. She looked at her reflection. "I knew he didn't love me," she whispered, "but I thought he could learn." Her sister reached for her hand. "You didn't deserve that." No, but she didn't either. They didn't speak again. News traveled fast in Willowbrook. That night, guests shared recaps over wine and texts. Online whispers returned. This time, Celine's name wasn't spoken with suspicion. It carried weight, reverence. Clips surfaced from guests who'd recorded Lior walking down the aisle. One post read, "She didn't crash the wedding. She told the truth in the one place it couldn't be ignored." Another, "That boy has more courage than most grown men I know." And still another, he called him father, and the man said nothing. Callan locked himself away in his penthouse apartment, blinds drawn, liquor untouched. He watched the footage once, twice, stopped at the moment Celine stepped forward, her poise, her restraint. She hadn't humiliated him. She had liberated herself, and somehow that made it worse. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment by the sea, Lior sat at the kitchen table scribbling in a notebook. Celine cooked dinner, humming softly to a tune only she could hear. Lior looked up. "Mom?" "Yes, love. Did I do okay?" She turned around, smiling gently. "You were brave, and kind, and honest. He looked down, shyly pleased. "Will I see him again?" he asked. Her eyes softened. "Maybe one day," she said, "but only if he learns to be the kind of man who deserves your time." Lior nodded. That was enough. They ate quietly that night. No headlines, no gossip, no judgments, just warmth, just truth, just peace. Celine sat by the window later, watching the moonlight stretch across the waves. Her phone buzzed with messages, strangers sending thanks, women sending strength, and a few apologies from people she'd once called friends. She didn't reply to most, but she read them, every one, because it meant something, to finally be seen not as someone's mistake but as her own victory. The story that had once belonged to Callan Rivers was no longer his to control. In the days following the wedding disaster, his name trended for all the wrong reasons. His team went quiet, invitations slowed, contracts got reviewed. He posted nothing. Not because he was protecting Celine, but because he was protecting himself. He reached out once, a single message, no apology, just a half-hearted line that read, "We should talk sometime." Celine never responded, and that silence said more than any long-winded speech could. Months passed. Willowbrook kept moving, as small towns do. People found new gossip, new events, new distractions. The Rivers family tucked the scandal away behind forced smiles and revised press releases. But Celine? She moved forward, not to forget, but to live. She and Lior relocated to a quiet coastal town called Emberlight, a place with salt in the air, bookstores on every block, and sunsets that didn't apologize for being loud. She rented a small space on the corner of a cobblestone street. It used to be an old tailor's shop. The windows were tall and inviting. The walls still smelled faintly of cedar. There she opened the Nest and Spine, a bookshop cafe filled with mismatched chairs, handwritten poetry on chalkboards, and coffee that tasted like comfort. Every corner of the shop held a story. The bell above the door came from her grandmother's house. The teacups were thrifted from every town she'd ever lived in. And behind the counter, on a high shelf, sat a photo of Lior in his Spider-Man pajamas, holding a sign that read, "Mom's Dream, now real." It wasn't grand. It was real. And that was enough. Lior enrolled in school just 2 blocks away. He made friends quickly, joined a tiny creative writing club, and started walking to the shop after class, where he'd drink cocoa and read to the elderly customers who adored him. Celine's face began to soften again, less guarded, more open. She smiled more, slept better. She started reading for herself again, not just to Lior. Her hands, once always tense, moved freely as she arranged flowers, flipped pages, wrote poems. One rainy Thursday, he walked in, Cassian Vale, mid-30s, tall with hands that looked like they built things, a camera bag slung across his shoulder. His eyes were gentle but tired, like someone who had learned to live with quiet pain. He asked for black coffee, no sugar. She served it in a blue cup. He looked around. This place smells like someone read 100 good books and decided to live inside one. She laughed for the first time that week. He came back the next day, and the one after that. They didn't flirt. They talked about books, about raising kids alone, about how the world can break you and still expect you to show up smiling. Cassian was a widower. His wife had died 3 years earlier, leaving him with a daughter named Ava. He didn't talk about it much, not because he was hiding, but because the grief was still stitched into his every breath. Celine understood that silence. She didn't pry, and that was why he returned. He said once, while sipping tea near the window, "It's rare to meet someone who lets you breathe at your own pace." She smiled. It's rare to meet someone who doesn't expect you to shrink to fit their story. Their conversations grew longer. Their silences became more comfortable. Lior and Ava met one afternoon by accident. He offered her a cookie. She offered him a crayon. They'd been inseparable since. Soon the children began drawing pictures together at the shop. Dinosaurs, dragons, dream houses. Sometimes Cassian and Celine would just sit nearby, watching them, exchanging the kind of glances that don't rush. Nothing about their love was urgent. It was patient, warm, true, and it was only beginning. The weeks turned into months. Autumn came to Emberlight with orange skies and cinnamon in the air. At the Nest and Spine, Celine swapped out summer poetry for fall verses on the chalkboard. Lior and Ava began hosting a story hour every Saturday morning, reading aloud to toddlers and elderly patrons with bright smiles and homemade bookmarks. Cassian kept showing up, sometimes to take photos for local artists, sometimes to help fix a wobbly table leg, sometimes just to sit quietly with her in the golden afternoon. But one Thursday evening, as twilight pressed against the cafe windows, he stayed after closing. Leo and Ava were in the back, giggling over a comic they were drawing. The bell above the door had long stopped ringing. The town outside had gone quiet. Cassian helped her wipe down the counters. Then he paused, drying his hands on a cloth. "I keep thinking," he said softly, "that I'm waiting for the right time." She looked at him, one eyebrow lifted. "For what? To tell you I want to know everything, and not run away." Celine leaned against the counter, watching him. "I'm not used to people wanting the full version," she said. "They usually like the edited one." "I lost someone I loved," he said. "I don't want shortcuts anymore." There was no background music, no grand performance, just the sound of his voice, and the warmth in it. Celine crossed the small space between them and touched his hand. "I'm scared," she whispered. He nodded. "Me too." And then he kissed her. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't polished, it felt like a sunrise, slow, sure, and deeply needed. They didn't speak as they climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment above the shop. Leor was sleeping in his bunk, Ava on a pull-out in the reading room. The floor creaked. A candle flickered on the bedside table. Outside, the street light hummed. Their love didn't explode. It settled. It moved like two rivers meeting, gentle, deliberate, flowing towards something whole. Cassian undressed her like she was made of history. She touched him like he was real and here and human, not a replacement, not a rescue. When they lay together, it wasn't about filling silence. It was about sharing it. No one claimed anything. They simply allowed each other to exist, fully, freely, softly. Afterward, Celine rested her head on his chest. His fingers traced her spine like he was memorizing it. "I don't need you to be perfect," he murmured. She smiled into his skin. "Good. I'm done pretending to be." That night's sleep came easily, for both of them. Weeks later, Celine hosted a small evening reading in the cafe. The shop was filled with neighbors, poetry lovers, and friends from around town. The room glowed with string lights and clinking mugs. Cassian stood at the back, Ava on one side, Lear on the other. Celine stepped to the mic, a folded piece of paper in her hand. "I used to think my story ended the day I walked away from a wedding I wasn't meant to be part of," she said. "But now I know, sometimes the ending you feared is just an introduction to something better." She read her poem aloud, voice steady. When she finished, applause filled the cafe, not loud, but full. Afterward, Leor ran up to her, beaming. "Mom, did you see my drawing in the window?" She nodded. "I always do." Cassian wrapped his arm around her waist. "You're home now," he said. Celine didn't need to reply. She already was. If you believe that real love doesn't demand you hide your past, hit that subscribe button. This is what Mr. Ross Story Trail is all about. Some stories don't end in noise. Some stories end in quiet courage. Celine's story didn't need revenge. It needed truth. Not the kind shouted across tables or blasted through public speeches, but the kind you carry in your chest, beating, steady, until one day it simply stands up and speaks for itself. She was never broken. She was never lesser. She was never a cautionary tale. She was a woman who loved deeply, who lost, who survived, and who rebuilt a life not out of spite, but out of hope. Because survival is not shameful. Because having a past doesn't make you unworthy. Because healing isn't linear, and it's never too late to rewrite the ending. The world often rushes to label women who walk away. Too emotional, too messy, too complicated. But Celine didn't walk away because she was afraid of love. She walked away because she finally understood that real love doesn't ask you to hide the parts of yourself that hurt. It holds space for them. It honors them. It waits for them. Callan had every chance to rise, but when given the truth, he chose silence. He chose appearance over accountability, image over intimacy. And that silence, it cost him everything, because silence, when used to avoid growth, becomes a wall. Celine refused to keep knocking on that wall. Instead, she turned away from it and found a door. And on the other side of that door was her son, her dreams, and eventually, Cassian. Someone who didn't ask her to shrink. Someone who didn't run from her story. Someone who knew that love isn't possession, it's presence. Cassian never tried to fix her. He simply stood beside her, day after day, word after word, cup after cup. And that was what made it real. Love that is quiet but unwavering. Love that isn't threatened by history. Love that sees every scar as proof of survival. Celine's transformation wasn't a straight line. It was slow, stumbling, sometimes backwards, but each step was her own. From the moment she left Willowbrook, she stopped trying to prove her worth and started choosing it. And that's what real redemption looks like. Not public applause, not viral sympathy, but peace, self-respect. A life lived on your own terms. She didn't need to be saved. She needed to be seen. And in the end, she saw herself first. That is the real love story. Not the one in white dresses and garden estates, but the one told in second chances and quiet nights beside someone who finally knows how to hold your hand without pulling you backward. So if you've ever felt like your story was too complicated to be loved, this story is for you. You are not too much. You are not too late. You are not unworthy. There is someone out there who will not just accept your truth, but cherish it. Maybe that someone is already in your life. Maybe it's someone you'll meet tomorrow. Or maybe, just maybe, that someone needs to be you first. And that's enough. That's more than enough. What did this story teach you about truth and second chances? Drop a comment. Let your voice be part of the healing. And if this touched something in you, share it. You never know who might need a story like this to believe in love again.